Welcome to this video lecture. I am Syed Junaid Nawaz. In this video lecture, we will define angle modulation schemes in general, and in particular, we will discuss its two special cases, which are frequency and phase modulation schemes. In these modulation schemes, the phase and frequency of the carrier signal is modified with respect to the amplitude of information signal. In first part of the lecture, we will derive time domain expressions for angle modulation schemes, and we will conduct time domain analysis for angle modulation schemes. While in the second part of this lecture, we will see some example waveforms of both frequency and phase modulated signals. So let's start it. Information signals are usually composed of low frequency components. To transmit such signals, a very large antenna is required because of the inverse relationship between the physical dimensions of an antenna and the frequency being transmitted to transmit the signal with a reasonable gain. Therefore, we require modulation of the information signal over a carrier signal which is from the band which is reasonable for transmission in all aspects, in terms of the antenna size required for its transmission, in terms of propagation characteristics, in terms of the noises behavior. So for example, if we have an information signal m of t being transmitted and the carrier signal is f of t, and the modulated signal after performing the modulation which is being transmitted from the transmitter, if it is phi of t, a carrier signal is a pure sinusoid wave of the frequency from pass band, a band at which a signal can be passed through the channel. That's why it is referred as a pass band signal. So if we write expression of the carrier signal f of t, it is a pure sinusoid which has a peak amplitude, for example AC, into cos of omega ct plus theta naught. From this signal, AC represents the peak amplitude of the carrier signal, while omega ct plus theta naught represents its instantaneous phase. So if we define the instantaneous phase theta of t as omega ct plus theta naught, we can refer to its first part, which is omega ct, as the running phase, as it is a function of time, and we can refer to the second part of the instantaneous phase as phase shift, which is a constant value which is not a function of time for this sinusoid wave. In our previous chapter, we represented the information signal over the carrier signal in terms of fluctuations in the peak amplitude of carrier signal, while in this chapter we will represent the information signal over the carrier signal in terms of fluctuations in the phases or in the angles of the carrier signal. To start the discussion about angle modulation schemes, we first need to establish a relationship between instantaneous phases and instantaneous frequencies of such carrier signals. So if we just see a hypothetical case of the instantaneous phase, if we plot the instantaneous phase theta of t with respect to time, that is equation number 2 here, being this as equation number 1. If we analyze equation number 2, it represents a straight line where omega c represents its slope and theta naught represents its intersection point of vertical axis. While if we make these phase shifts as time varying, then it may not be a straight line, while it can be assumed as a straight line for certain points, for example between time instant t0 and t1, where the separation between these 2 points is delta t, which is reasonably a small value. Between these points we can assume the instantaneous phase as a straight line. If we write the equation of carrier signal again, theta naught is a constant number if time is restricted between t0 and t1. This becomes more true if the separation span between t0 and t1 approaches to 0. So to represent information signal on the angles of carrier signal, we can either represent it directly into the phase, or information can be represented directly over the frequencies. So a relationship between instantaneous phase of the carrier signal and instantaneous frequency can be established as, if we take derivative of the instantaneous phase, we obtain instantaneous frequency as where theta naught can be ignored, being a constant number. So derivative of instantaneous phase represents instantaneous frequency. This is an important relationship which will be exploited throughout this chapter. If we express this relationship in terms of a diagram, instantaneous phase can be translated to instantaneous frequency by taking derivative of the instantaneous phase, and by integrating the instantaneous frequency over time, instantaneous phase can be obtained. So in order to represent information over the carrier signal, either it can be represented in terms of introducing variations in the instantaneous phase of carrier with respect to the amplitude of information signal, or the instantaneous frequency of the carrier signal can be varied with respect to the amplitude of information signal. This part represents the instantaneous phase of the carrier signal, while omega c represents the frequency of carrier signal. So the first form of angle modulation schemes is phase modulation scheme, where information is directly represented over the instantaneous phase of the carrier signal, starting by representing its time domain expression. In this type of angle modulation scheme, the instantaneous phase of the carrier is directly modified, directly changed with respect to the amplitude of information signal. If we consider a simpler case of theta of t without losing generality of the signal as omega ct, while ignoring the constant phase shift which was being added in the running phase omega ct. So the expression for phase modulated signals can be written as omega ct represents the running phase and m of t is causing shifts in the running phase. If information signal has a certain amplitude at a certain time instant, a phase shift proportional to the amplitude of information signal is introduced into the phases of carrier signal. So information signal is causing fluctuations in the phases in the angles of the carrier signal. Such modulation scheme where information is directly added into the running phase is called phase modulation scheme. However, to control the shift introduced by the information signal into the phases of carrier signal, we scale the information signal with a certain constant number, let's say Kp. This constant scaling factor is introduced to scale the information signal prior to adding it into the running phase of the carrier signal. This is to control the amount of shift being provided by the information signal into the phase to restrict it into an acceptable limit. So if we see the instantaneous frequencies of this phase modulated signal, where this part represents instantaneous phase of this modulated signal, if we write expression for the instantaneous theta of t, it is running phase, that is omega ct, plus phase shift introduced by the information signal. We can obtain an expression for instantaneous frequencies as the derivative with respect to time of the instantaneous phase is equal to instantaneous frequency. So if we take derivative of the first part with respect to time, omega c being a constant number with respect to time plus kp being a constant number multiplied by the derivative of information signal. M dot of t, for example, represents the derivative of m of t. So when information is directly added into the running phase, derivative of information signal is actually being added into the frequencies. When we fluctuate, when we modify the instantaneous phase directly with respect to information signal, the instantaneous frequencies also modify a long time. However, the equivalent representation in the modifications in frequencies are that frequencies are modified according to the derivative of information signal. So we can draw this conclusion that when information signal is being added into the phase, the equivalent operation can be represented as derivative of information being added with the frequency of carrier signal. So in both phase and frequency modulation schemes, both phases and frequencies are modified with a certain relationship. As information is directly being added into the phase, its equivalent operation in terms of frequencies can be seen as that derivative of information is being added into the frequency. We call such modulation scheme as phase modulation scheme. However, if we directly add information signal into the frequency, such modulation scheme will be referred as frequency modulation, where information signal is directly added into the frequency of carrier signal. As we know that instantaneous frequency can be obtained from the instantaneous phase by taking derivative of instantaneous phase, while by taking integral of instantaneous frequency we obtain instantaneous phase. So if we take integral of this signal, this instantaneous frequency, then we will obtain the instantaneous phase. So for frequency modulated signals, the instantaneous phase can be represented as the integral of instantaneous frequency along time, that is from minus infinity to current time instant. Then if we take integral of this equation, then we obtain omega ct from the first part. If we integrate omega c over time from minus infinity to current time instant, after substituting the limits, we obtain omega ct from the first part, while from the second part we will get integral of m of t, where t is being used in the limits of the integral. So we use another variable here for the time for the integral. If we use this instantaneous phase and generate a carrier signal, then such modulation scheme is referred as frequency modulation. So a frequency modulated signal can be represented in time as peak amplitude of the carrier, which is not being modified in such angle modulation schemes. By substituting the equation of instantaneous phase into the equation of carrier signal, we get expression for frequency modulation scheme. Similar to phase modulation, a constant number, let's say k of f, will be multiplied with the factor which modifies the instantaneous phase. This is to limit the phase shift and the frequency deviation introduced by adding this part into the carrier's phase. So we'll discuss its influence on the bandwidth and other factors later. If we compare both frequency and phase modulations and conduct some analysis, then we get if we also write the expressions for both instantaneous phase and instantaneous frequencies for both phase and frequency modulation schemes to compare these two modulation schemes, it can be observed that in phase modulation scheme, the running phase are directly changed with respect to the amplitude of information signal, while in frequency modulation, the instantaneous phase are changed with respect to the integral of information signal. Since phases are being directly changed in the phase modulation scheme with respect to information signal, that's why we have named it as phase modulation scheme. When the information is directly added into the frequency of the carrier signal, such modulation scheme is defined as frequency modulation scheme. However, when we change the frequencies directly with respect to the amplitude of information signal, its equivalent representation on phase is that the instantaneous phases are modified with respect to the integral of information signal. In the phase modulation scheme, the frequencies are modified with respect to the derivative of information signal. As conclusion, we can state that the relationship between instantaneous phases and instantaneous frequencies is the base to define frequency and phase modulation schemes. In both the modulation schemes, the angle is being changed with respect to the information signal, while in phase modulation, the phases are directly changed with respect to the information signal amplitude, while in frequency modulation schemes, the frequencies are directly changed with respect to the amplitude of information signal. By comparing these two equations, we can write a generalized time domain expression for exponential modulation scheme in generalized form as plus some representation of information signal being added into the running phase. This expression represents both phase and frequency modulation schemes. If psi of t is substituted as equal to a scaled variant of information signal, then this equation represents phase modulation scheme. While if psi of t is substituted as a scaled and integrated variant of information signal, then this generalized expression of exponential modulation schemes represent the case of frequency modulation. So for example, there is a certain system, a certain filter, for example, h of omega. If we give information signal as input to this system and we get psi of t, then if this system is not changing the input, then psi of t will be equal to m of t, and expression for exponential modulation schemes will represent the case of phase modulation. While if this filter represents the integration operation and it integrates the input signal m of t and we obtain psi of t, then this generalized form of exponential modulation scheme will represent the case of frequency modulation scheme. So if this filter's response represents some third type of response, then this exponential modulation scheme will represent some third type of exponential modulation scheme. We can have different responses for h of omega, and we can obtain different types of exponential modulation scheme from this expression. Frequency and phase modulation are two special types of exponential modulation scheme, while we can design several such modulation schemes. As it is clearly evident that phase and frequency modulation schemes are directly related to each other, we can obtain frequency modulation from the phase modulator, and we can obtain phase modulation from the frequency modulator. For example, if we have a phase modulator, a hardware which performs phase modulation, then instead of providing information signal as input to this signal, if we provide integral of the information signal as input to this signal, then overall response of this system will be equivalent to frequency modulation. Or we can see, if we replace the equation of m of t with the integral of m of t in the equation of phase modulation signals, we obtain the expression for the frequency modulation case. So the overall response of this system is not a phase modulated signal, instead it is a frequency modulated signal, because instead of information signal, integral of information signal is being provided as input to the phase modulator. Therefore, this relationship between instantaneous phases and frequencies will help to obtain a frequency modulated signal from a phase modulator. Similarly, if we have a frequency modulator, that can be used to generate a phase modulated signal, as if the input of this frequency modulator is provided as the derivative of information signal instead of directly providing the information signal. Overall response of such system will be the response of a phase modulator. So we will obtain a phase modulated signal from a frequency modulated signal if the derivative of information signal is provided as input to the frequency modulator, that is replacing the input information signal with the derivative of information signal, and simplifying this expression we will get m of t here, which is equal to the expression of phase modulation schemes. Or in generalized form, the expression of exponential modulation scheme was, a block diagram for such modulation schemes can be drawn as that information signal is being processed through a filter, let's say through a system or a filter h of omega, and information signal is modified as psi of t. If such signal is provided as input to the phase modulator, then we obtain an exponential modulated signal in generalized form. So for this whole system, which is representing exponential modulation schemes, in generalized form, if the response of h of omega is equal to 1, then this system is representing phase modulation scheme. However, if the response of h of omega is equal to the integration operation of the information signal, then this system is representing phase modulation. However, for any other response, some other type of exponential modulation scheme is being represented by this system. In terms of the deviation caused in the frequency of the carrier signal by both phase and frequency modulation schemes, and the shifts caused in the phase of the carrier signal by both frequency and phase modulation schemes, we can conduct an analysis. For example, for the case of phase modulation and for the case of frequency modulation, the expression for instantaneous phase can be written as, and the expressions for instantaneous frequencies can be written as, where it can be observed that in the case of frequency modulation, information is added into the frequencies. For the case of phase modulation, derivative of information signal is being added into the frequencies. So the labels are assigned with respect to the direct impact of information signal being introduced in phases or in frequencies for the case of phase and frequency modulation respectively. So if we conduct analysis for the bandwidth consumption, that is the maximum and the minimum frequency being generated. So for the case of frequency modulation scheme, the instantaneous frequency represents the carrier frequency. The second part is introducing shift into the central frequency of the carrier signal. So the overall frequency at a certain time instant represents the carrier signal's frequency, that is omega c, and a shift in frequency. So the maximum frequency that will be generated at a certain time will be the central frequency plus when the peak amplitude of information signal is experienced. For example, if we are saying a positive peak, we can represent it with MP plus, and the minimum frequency generated by a frequency modulated signal will be for the time instant when a negative peak of the information signal is received. That is, substituting different values of m of t here for different time intervals. If m of t is an information signal which has certain profile along time, and its positive peak amplitude is MP, which is same as its negative amplitude MP. So as this information signal is directly being added into the frequencies, when the maximum value for m of t is received for this time instant, for example t naught, at this particular time instant t naught, the frequency being generated by the modulated signal will be the maximum frequency. While at some other time instant, let's say t1, a negative peak amplitude is experienced, and by substituting this negative peak into this expression as the value of m of t, we get a frequency which is the minimum frequency being generated by the frequency modulated signals. Similarly, we can see the maximum and minimum frequencies being generated for the case of phase modulation, as the frequencies are being influenced with respect to the derivative of information signal. When a peak amplitude of the derivative of information signal is received here, at that time instant a maximum or a minimum frequency in the case of phase modulated signals will be received. That is, omega max is equal to omega c plus the shift in frequencies, where the peak of this shift in frequencies can be represented as the peak of the derivative signal of the information signal. Similarly, the minimum frequency generated for the case of phase modulation will be the central frequency omega c minus the peak amplitude of the derivative of information signal. Information signal, which was originally composed of low frequency signals, was added into the phases or frequencies of the carrier signal for phase and frequency modulations respectively, and the maximum frequency which is being generated for both phase and frequency modulation and the minimum frequency which is being generated for the case of phase and frequency modulation schemes depend upon the peak amplitude of information signal or the peak amplitude of the derivative of information signal. So roughly, the bandwidth consumption for both the modulation schemes can be analyzed from these expressions, where it can be observed that the shift caused in the carrier frequency is proportional to the amplitudes of information signal and the constant scaling factor which was being multiplied with the information signal. By controlling this constant parameter, the maximum frequency being generated can be controlled, and by controlling this constant parameter kf, the minimum frequency that can be generated can also be controlled. So the bandwidth consumption of such modulation schemes can be manipulated by manipulating these constant parameters kf and kp. Similarly, here for the case of phase modulation, this constant parameter is being multiplied with the information signal's derivative, and it is scaling the shift caused in the central frequency. So by manipulating this kp parameter, the maximum and minimum frequencies being generated can be manipulated and overall bandwidth consumption can be manipulated. So writing these expressions in terms of f. Similarly, for the case of phase modulation, the maximum and minimum frequencies can be expressed as, where the first part of these expressions represent the central frequency, that is the frequency of carrier signal, and second part of these expressions represents the deviation in frequency introduced by the representation of information signal. So the maximum deviation, that is the peak deviation from the carrier signal, can be represented as, that is delta f here, as delta f is equal to the maximum frequency being generated minus the carrier frequency, or carrier frequency minus the minimum frequency being generated. That is true if the peak amplitude on the positive amplitudes is equal to the negative peak amplitudes of information signal. That is, the deviation from the carrier frequency towards the positive side and the negative side will be equal. That is, We are considering same peak amplitude for both positive and negative amplitudes of the information signal. The peak frequency deviation for the case of phase modulation can be represented as the peak amplitude of information signal's derivative signal multiplied by the scaling factor Kp divided by 2 pi, while for the case of frequency modulated signals, the peak frequency deviation can be represented as the scaling factor Kf multiplied by the peak amplitude of information signal divided by 2 pi. While the maximum shift experienced in the phases for the case of phase modulation is equal to Kp into the peak amplitude of information signal, and maximum phase shift experienced for the case of frequency modulated signals is equal to Kf multiplied by the peak amplitude of the integral of information signal. M of t is being provided as input to an integrator, and we obtain m hat of t, and the peak amplitude of the output signal of this integrator is represented by mp hat. So because information signal was directly influencing the frequencies for the case of frequency modulation, therefore the peak amplitude of information signal is causing the peak deviation in the frequencies. While for the case of phase modulation, the derivative of information signals cause the fluctuations in frequencies, therefore the peak amplitude of the derivative of information signal will cause the peak frequency deviation. For the case of phase modulation, information is directly added into the phases, therefore peak amplitude of information signal causes the peak phase shift in the carrier signal, while the integral of information signal's peak amplitude causes the peak phase shift in the carrier signal. Roughly, this delta F can provide a picture of the bandwidth consumption by both phase and frequency modulation schemes, while the exact bandwidth which is being consumed by these two modulation schemes is infinitely large, which we will discuss in our upcoming lecture. So let's see some example waveforms for both phase and frequency modulation schemes. So if we have an information signal as a triangular wave which has its positive peak amplitude at +1 and its negative peak amplitude as -1 with a time period of 2 into 10 raised to the power -4 seconds, then for the case of frequency modulation, as represented by the equation derived for the case of frequency modulated signals, the instantaneous frequency is directly influenced by the amplitude of information signal, where the maximum shift, the maximum deviation caused in the central frequency is experienced when the peak of information signal is arrived, that is, and the minimum frequency is experienced when the negative peak of information signal arrives. By using these relationships, we can find the maximum frequency generated that will be generated at the point where the peak amplitude of information signal is experienced, for example the time instant t1, and the minimum frequency generated that will be generated where the negative peak of information signal is received, for example at time instances t2, t4, and positive peaks are experienced at time instances t1, t3. So for these time instances, the positive and negative peaks are being received for the information signal, which will cause the highest and the lowest frequency shifts in the carrier signal's frequency. So at the time instances where the negative peak of the information signal is being experienced, the lowest frequency of the modulated signal will be generated, that is f minimum, which is generated as fc minus the peak frequency deviation, that is delta f. And for the instances where the positive peak of information signal is experienced, the maximum frequency of the modulated signal will be generated, that is f max fc plus delta f, where delta f represents the maximum deviation caused in the frequency of carrier signal by the amplitude of information signal. For instance, if we consider that carrier frequency fc is equal to 100 megahertz and the constant kf is equal to 2 pi into 10 raised to the power 5, the minimum frequency can be calculated as 100 megahertz minus delta f. Delta f is defined as kf constant 2 pi into 10 to the power 5 multiplied by the peak amplitude of information signal, that is plus 1 and minus 1 for this example, divided by 2 pi. And similarly, maximum frequency can be computed as 100 megahertz plus delta f, which can be computed as 100.1 megahertz, the maximum frequency being generated in the frequency modulated signal for this example information signal, and 99.9 megahertz, the minimum frequency being generated, where between this maximum and minimum frequency, it was the central frequency, the carrier frequency, which was 100 megahertz. So when the amplitude of information signal is at its negative peak, a carrier signal with a frequency of 99.9 MHz will be generated, while along the increase in the amplitude of information signal, an increase in the frequency of frequency modulated signal will be experienced. When the amplitude of information signal is equal to 0, exactly the carrier frequency Fc will be generated, that is 100 megahertz, while when the positive peak amplitude of the information signal will be received, the frequency of the modulated signal will be equal to 100.1 megahertz. Similarly, a decrease in the amplitude of information signal will cause a decrease in the frequency of modulated signal from positive peak amplitude to the negative peak amplitude. A frequency shift from maximum frequency to the minimum frequency will be experienced. And when again the amplitude of information signal is increasing, the frequency of the carrier signal will increase, and again along the decrease in amplitude of information signal, the frequency of carrier signal will decrease. As in frequency modulated signals, instantaneous frequency of the carrier signal is directly being influenced by the amplitude of information signal. So if we plot the modulated signal for the case of frequency modulated signals, we get as let's say for the time instant t0, we will experience the minimum frequency of the carrier, while at time instant t1, exactly the carrier frequency will be generated, and time instant t2, the maximum frequency of the modulated signal will be generated. Since the amplitude of information signal is linearly increasing, the frequency of the modulated signal will start increasing linearly, while the peak amplitudes of the carrier signal or the modulated signal will remain constant throughout the modulated signal. So with an increase from -1 to +1 in the amplitudes of information signal, an increase in the frequency of the modulated signal is generated, as the information signal's amplitudes are being directly translated on the frequencies of the modulated signal. Similarly, with a decrease in the amplitude of information signal, we'll experience a decrease in the frequency of the modulated signal. Again, the amplitude of information signal is increasing along the time. An increase in the frequency of modulated signal will be experienced. And at this particular time instant, let's say t7, maximum frequency of the modulated signal will be generated, and so on. Directly proportional to the amplitudes of information signal, the frequency of the modulated signal will be generated. So for the time instant t0, exact the frequency being generated at this time instant, the instantaneous frequency here will be equal to fc. For the time instant, let's say t1, the frequency at this time instant, the instantaneous frequency will be equal to the maximum frequency of the modulated signal, which was equal to fc plus delta f. Minimum frequency of the modulated signal will be generated at the points at the time instances where the negative peak of information signal is experienced, which was equal to fc minus delta f. As in this information signal, the amplitude of information signal is linearly increasing. We have experienced a linear increase in the frequencies of modulated signal. When a negative peak of information signal is received, the minimum frequency of the modulated signal is generated. When a zero amplitude in the information signal is received, exactly the carrier frequency is being generated. When a positive peak of the information signal is being received, the maximum frequency of the modulated signal is being generated, while the minimum frequency was equal to fc minus delta f and maximum frequency was equal to fc plus delta f, and delta f represents the peak frequency shift experienced in the carrier frequency. For the case of phase modulation, the frequencies of the carrier signal are modified with respect to the derivative of information signal. So it is convenient to manipulate the plots in terms of fluctuations in the frequencies instead of manipulating the changes experienced in the phases of carrier signal. So as for the case of phase modulated signal, the frequencies are modified with respect to the derivative of information signal. For this example, the information signal is composed of multiple straight lines, so we can take its derivative for different intervals. For example, for the first straight line from -1 to +1, its derivative represents its slope, while slope can be obtained as by this formula, where the value of y2 is +1 and the value of y1 is -1, so -1 -1 makes +1. The time between two consecutive positive peaks is 2 into 10 raised to the power -4 seconds, where we are observing a span half of the time between two positive peaks. So the difference between the second point and first point along horizontal axis will be equal to 1 into 10 raised to the power -4. After some mathematical calculations, we obtained 2 into 10 raised to the power 4 as slope of this first line, and for the interval equal to from t0 to t1, a constant slope is being experienced, which is 2 into 10 raised to the power 4, which is of the amplitude 2 into 10 raised to the power 4. Similarly, for the second line, that is from the time instant t2 to t4, the slope of line can be calculated as 2 minus 2 into 10 raised to the power 4, and so on. So this is the derivative signal of the information signal. If the frequencies of carrier signal are fluctuated with respect to the derivative of information signal, we are effectively performing phase modulation. As in phase modulation schemes, phases of the carrier signal are directly changed with respect to the amplitude of information signal, while the frequencies of carrier signal are changed with respect to the derivative of information signal. We have obtained the derivative signal of information signal. With respect to this derivative signal, if the frequencies of the carrier signal are modified, we can generate a phase modulated signal. So for this span, we have a high constant amplitude. Since the amplitude is constant and amplitude is high, a high frequency will be generated and a constant frequency will be generated. So for the positive peak of the derivative of information signal, the maximum frequency of the modulated signal will be generated. That was f max, which was equal to fc plus delta f, where delta f represents the peak frequency shift experienced in the carrier's frequency, which was equal to kp into the peak amplitude of the derivative of information signal divided by 2 pi. Similarly, for this span where the amplitude of the derivative of information signal is at the negative peak value, a low frequency of the carrier signal will be generated. Again, the amplitude of information's derivative signal is high directly with respect to the amplitude of the derivative of information signal. The frequency of the carrier signal will change for such phase modulation schemes. So for within a certain span, for example for this span, as the amplitude of the derivative of information signals are constant, therefore a modulated signal with a constant frequency will be generated for this span, while since the amplitudes are at the negative peak, the lowest frequency will be generated for this span. That was f minimum, which we defined as fc minus delta f. For the same example where we considered fc as 100 megahertz, and if the constant kp is set as equal to 10 pi, then f max and f min can be calculated as 99.1 megahertz for f min and 100.1 megahertz as f max. That is a carrier frequency fc of 100 megahertz. The maximum frequency f max that is being generated is 100.1 megahertz, and the minimum frequency that is being generated is 99.9, sorry, it was 99.9 megahertz. So in frequency domain, the frequency band from the minimum frequency to the maximum frequency will be occupied. While we may experience more power at certain bands at different time instances, and we may experience shift in the concentration of power in frequency domain along time. For the same information signal of this triangular wave, the frequency modulated signal, if we perform frequency modulation and the frequencies of carrier signal are directly modified with respect to the amplitude of this information signal, the frequency modulated signal will look like this signal, where directly with respect to the increase or decrease in the amplitude of information signal, an increase or decrease in the frequencies of modulated signal will be experienced, while for the same information signal, the frequencies in the case of phase modulated signal will change with respect to the derivative of information signal, and we may see different frequencies for different spans, but for the same information signal, the frequency and phase modulated signals will appear as different as seen in this example. The time domain expression for exponential modulated signal was where the peak amplitudes are constant throughout all the time instances of the modulated signal. Running phase is being changed, being manipulated with respect to certain representation of information signal. This psi of t can be directly the information signal, which represents the case of phase modulation, while it can be integral of information signal, which represents the case of frequency modulation, and it can be some other kind of representation of information signal, which represents some other kind of exponential modulation schemes. In this lecture, we have derived and we have analyzed the time domain expression for exponential modulation schemes, while we have discussed its two special cases, which are frequency and phase modulation, in detail. And in next lecture, we will further extend this analysis to frequency domain. Thank you for attending this lecture. If you have any comments or questions, you can certainly write me through email, or you can ask during our upcoming online session.